There's something wonderfully comforting about the sight, sounds and smells of a steam engine on a chilly winter's morning. Although it's still early, about 8 AM, there's a distinct air of bustle and anticipation as drivers and firemen begin the task of preparing their engines for the day ahead. This is the headquarters of the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway at Toddington, and today is the last full steam day of the year before the Santa specials take over for the festive season. As a preserved railway, the GWR has steadily grown in popularity, attracting visitors from all over the world to this truly beautiful location at the foot of the Cotswold Hills. But even by the GWR's exceptionally high standards, today's visitors are in for a very special treat. Not only will this wonderful Great Western Railway collet 060 number 3205 be in steam, but the majestic Black Prince, British Railways standard 9F 210 number 92203 will also be in action throughout the course of the day. Before enjoying a closer look at these fine locomotives and watching the proceedings of the day, it's well worth taking a step back in time to discover a little of the fascinating history behind the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway, fondly referred to by her many regular visitors as the friendly line of the Cotswolds. This part of the English countryside looks extremely peaceful today, and it's hard to believe that at the beginning of the Great Railway Age it was a hotbed of controversy. George Stephenson, the inventor and founder of the railways, had laid a network of track across the north of England, and his railways were rapidly advancing south. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, at the remarkably young age of 27, had been appointed chief engineer of the Great Western Railway, running from London Paddington to Bristol Temple Meads, and further south through Exeter and the West Country to Penzance. Always innovative and never afraid to put his ideas to the test, Brunel disagreed with Stephenson and the already established railway companies about the width of the track. Stephenson had decided on a gauge, as track width is better known, of 4 feet 8.5 inches, based upon the average width of farm carts in his local area. Brunel used extensive engineering calculations to find an optimum width of 7 feet, which was described as broad gauge, and he used this throughout his Great Western network. Brunel truly believed that other railway companies would see the advantages of switching from Stephenson's narrow gauge, expecting the entire national network of railways to run his way. There's an old expression that can still be heard today, particularly amongst the turmoil that has resulted from the privatisation of modern railway services. Quite simply, there's a Great Western way to do things, and there's a wrong way. The same school of thought also claims that the letters GWR stand for God's Wonderful Railway, but for the purposes of this programme, we'll settle for them as an abbreviation for the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway. Unfortunately, Brunel had underestimated the power of the narrow gauge supporters, and despite the undoubted advancement he'd made on Stephenson's original concept, his mathematical calculations were rejected. A parliamentary committee passed an act ruling that all track should be laid to Stephenson's narrow gauge, and so 4 feet 8.5 inches became the standard gauge. The first railway to run in the vicinity of today's Gloucestershire-Warwickshire line was the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, which opened in 1840. This was soon taken over by the Midland Railway, who were looking for an opportunity to take their narrow gauge further south. Although Gloucester was important, it was Bristol Temple Meads, linked to Gloucester by broad gauge, that was the real target. Bristol was the key to the southwest, and no narrow gauge lines had access to Brunel's exclusive Great Western Station. Consequently, for a number of years, chaos regularly ensued at Gloucester, with freight and passengers alike needing to be transferred from wagons on narrow gauge to wagons on broad gauge and vice versa. Needless to say, it was situations like the one at Gloucester that made the government of the day step in and take action. A visiting delegation was appalled by the clamour arising from well-arranged confusion, of the shouting and addresses of consignments, the chucking of packages across from truck to truck, the inquiries for missing articles, and the loading, unloading and reloading. It did take some years for standardisation to put an end to such difficulties, but by 1892 broad gauge was definitely a thing of the past. While such complications were ongoing at Gloucester, the railway network was speedily cutting through the countryside of the Midlands. The Oxford, Worcester and Wolverhampton Railway came into being by 1853, and a branch from Honeybourne to Stratford-Upon-Avon opened on the 12th of July 1859. The Great Western Railway operated a branch from the Oxford to Birmingham route at Hatton, which advanced to Stratford-Upon-Avon in 1860. On the 1st of August 1899, the Great Western Railway obtained an Act of Parliament for the construction of a high-speed link between Honeybourne, south of Stratford-Upon-Avon, and Cheltenham, and it's this line that has been preserved in part to become the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway, which we are visiting today. The first section of line opened between Honeybourne and Broadway in 1904, and by the December of that year it had extended to Toddington. Winchcombe was reached in February 1905, Bishop's Cleeve in June 1906, and eventually Cheltenham in August 1906. Combined with a Great Western line that travelled further north of Stratford, the company had a vital route that linked the heart of the Midlands with the southwest. The magazine of the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway is actually called The Cornishman, in honour of the much-loved service that graced this line in the heyday of railway travel, from Wolverhampton all the way to Penzance. So popular was this train that in 1959 it would have cost you the grand sum of 2 shillings just to reserve a seat. By the early 1960s, the motor car was taking over the nation's holiday transportation, no longer the sole province of the railway excursion specials. The original Midland line, dating back to 1840, was used in preference, although BR did keep the Stratford-Upon-Avon to Cheltenham route open as a relief line until the mid-1970s. But the writing was on the wall, and in 1977 there was a total closure from Honeybourne southwards, and by 1979 everything had been dismantled. As with all preserved railways today, it took the vision of a small group of enthusiasts to start the ball rolling, and in 1976 the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway Society was formed. Originally their aim had been to prevent closure, but this was sadly unrealistic, and even the track was lifted before the enthusiasts could intervene. Tragic as this was, the growing band of supporters were undaunted, and in 1981 the Gloucestershire Steam Railway plc was incorporated to purchase trackbed and buildings. It took until February 1984 to acquire the stretch between the picturesque Cotswold town of Broadway and the outskirts of the elegant Georgian Cheltenham Spa. Initially, trains ran just a short distance between Toddington and Hales Abbey Holt. Then, as we'll see later, an extensive refurbishment of Winchcombe followed, and by 1990 the line stretched just a little further south of Gretton. At present, the GWR reaches the end of the line at Gotherington, a major piece of restoration which was completed in 1997, though as you will soon discover, it is only intended as a temporary terminus. The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway has some very big plans, and if the recent past is anything to go by, make sure you watch this space. There are still a few hours to go before visitors will begin to arrive here at Toddington, but a growing number of overalled people clutching tool bags and thermos flasks are now disappearing to various engines and carriages across the yard. A closer look at where an industrious group have gathered reveals one of the many treasures that has found refuge at Toddington. Fortunately, this engine is well signposted, and it's immediately obvious that we're looking at something rather special. This is GWR number 2807, the oldest privately owned Great Western locomotive, rescued after years of abandonment at Barry Scrapyard by Cotswold Steam Preservation Limited in 1981. Fondly known as a 28er, this 2800 class locomotive was built at Swindon in 1905, and during her working life travelled a staggering 1,472,687 miles. Steady and powerful, 2807, like many other 28ers, had a crucial role to play in World War I, carrying steam coal from Wales to the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. Once hostilities had ceased, there was plenty of scope for this locomotive, and there were numerous allocations until her final withdrawal from mainline service at Seven Tunnel Junction Shed in March 1963. The Cotswold Steam Preservation Group is proud of their achievements to date, although it will probably be another 5 years before 2807 is back in action. Volunteers work every other Saturday, enjoying the painstaking labours that will eventually see their skill and dedication justly rewarded. Despite a poor weather forecast, the rain is holding off, and both 3205 and Black Prince are showing steam. Today's steam passenger service will be hauled by 3205, and no matter how well an engine might be running, there is always a slightly tense atmosphere until steam is up, and everyone knows it will be all systems go. Considering the age of this locomotive, she is remarkably reliable, and this morning is proving to be no exception. Built at the famous Swindon Works in 1946, 3205 is the only surviving member of the 120-strong 2251 class, first introduced by C.B. Collett in 1930. Her first allocation was Gloucestershire, and over a period of years she worked both passenger and freight trains to Ross-on-Wye, Hereford, Ledbury, Cheltenham and Swindon. With later allocations to Worcester, Shrewsbury and the Somerset and Dorset line, 3205 was finally withdrawn from service in June 1965 and immediately bought by the 2251 Preservation Fund. In safe hands, the locomotive was overhauled at Buckfastleigh before moving to the Severn Valley Railway, pulling their inaugural public passenger train in 1970. Since then, 3205 has toured many of the country's preserved lines, including the Llangollen and the South Devon railways, and is always a popular visitor at the GWR, a line on which she frequently ran when in service at Gloucester all those years ago. Tucked away at the back of this engine shed is another locomotive designed by C.B. Collett. This is a 1400 class Great Western Railway 042 tank, and although she looks a little abandoned today, these engines were the classic branch line locomotive of their time. Anyone who's seen the famous Ealing comedy The Tipfield Thunderbolt will instantly recognise her characteristic design. Originally numbered in the 4800 series, 75 were built between 1932 and 1936, with renumbering taking place in 1946. This particular engine, number 1450, didn't work the Honeybourne line, but plenty of the type did, including 1401, 1402, 1421 and 1431. Built at Swindon in 1935, 1450 was allocated to Oxford, Slough, Exeter, Dulverton, Tiverton, Taunton and Exmouth Junction over the course of her working life. She was finally retired from service in 1965, along with number 1442, the last working pair of 1400 class engines in use. 1450 is now based at Toddington, with 1442 also in preservation, but in total only 4 examples of this charming locomotive have actually survived. Looking under tarpaulins and into sheds when there is so much of interest to see is extremely fascinating, and it's not something that visitors always have a chance to do. But quite frequently at the GWR, knowledgeable members will run a tour of the yard for the many parties in search of more in-depth information. The brick-built goods shed with a railway track running through it is now used for the repair and maintenance of locomotives, and is probably the most immaculate of its kind that you're ever likely to see. However, it's impossible to miss the imposing presence of Merchant Navy 35006 Peninsular and Orient, SNC. Close up, this locomotive, which has been undergoing restoration at Toddington since 1983, is enormous. It may seem huge for the present GWR line, but this railway society has always been ambitious, right from the very start. Realistically, there is every possibility that the GWR may well run again between Stratford and Cheltenham in the not too distant future, in which case P&O will be put to excellent use. The 35006 P&O Locomotive Society is a group of individuals dedicated to restoring this magnificent engine to its former glory. It certainly won't be an easy task. It's taken more than 15 years to get to the stage that you see today. But be assured, the day will come when P&O 35006 will pull out of this goods shed very definitely under her own steam. Back outside, the maroon Hunslet 060 saddle tank number 2409 King George waits patiently for some fine lining to complete her livery. This locomotive is actually owned by the GWR and was rescued from scrap, arriving at Toddington in 1981. After many years' sterling service as a colliery engine, starting at Linby in 1942, 2409 was eventually purchased by Titanic Steamship Enterprises, before her sad and sorry journey to Jeremy Walker Scrap Merchants of Witney. As the morning goes on, crowds are beginning to gather, and although the weather is to say the least disappointing, the added bonus of black prints now billowing steam is more than adequate compensation. This very special engine is owned by wildlife artist and conservationist David Shepherd. Black Prince is the newest privately owned mainline locomotive in the country, having been built at Swindon Works in 1959. After a short career with British Railways, working the massive iron ore trains from Liverpool docks and some of the heaviest passenger trains over the Mendips on the Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway, Black Prince was bought by David Shepherd in 1967, direct from Birkenhead Shed, in full working order, straight out of BR service for £3,000, with spares included. It's been a labour of love to maintain this engine's pristine condition, but fabulously rewarding. Today, David Shepherd is taking Black Prince out as a private excursion for friends. Admittedly, it's been rather touch and go over the last 48 hours as to whether Black Prince would be able to get up steam for the trip. But after being gently warmed up overnight, all is looking very promising. And as she comes in for final checks over the pit, everyone is more than satisfied with the morning's efforts. Black Prince will run this afternoon. first journey of the day is going to be by diesel, while 3025 is completing final preparations. On the GWR there is no turntable, so steam engines run from Toddington to Gotherington tender first. The return journey from Gotherington to Toddington is smokebox first, which is the traditional view that most people would expect to see of a locomotive. So for the purposes of this programme, we'll travel to Gotherington on the diesel and return by the glory of steam later in the day. Although the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway is predominantly run by steam, the historical importance of diesel locomotives has never been overlooked. There are some fine examples in use, dating back up to 40 years, and there are many railway enthusiasts who are diesel specialists. Unlike the steam engines, the loco has a cab at each end, making the turnaround very straightforward. At the present time, Gotherington is as close as the GWR trains get to Cheltenham, but this stunningly authentic station is not open to the public. The enthusiast who owns it is one of the founder members of the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway and has very kindly agreed to let us take a closer look. The station, which is built of local Cleve Hill stone, was opened in 1906. There was a small goods shed, a large signal box with 33 levers, of which 20 were in use, a 15-ton weighbridge, a 6-ton crane in the yard, and a lengthy siding that could take up to 20 wagons. Cattle and pigs would be transferred here to a holding pen to await trains for Gloucester Market. In fact, more cattle herded up the station approach than humans, making it necessary for there to be a separate, narrow pedestrian walkway running parallel to the main drive. It's hard to imagine such a noisy, chaotic scene looking at the peaceful tranquility that is Gotherington Station today. No doubt there was plenty of organic matter to make the station master's garden grow. Gotherington became a halt in 1941. An early closure of the facility in June 1955 was probably its saving grace. Demolition wasn't the first option, as the soundly built platform buildings, the stone walls are 2 feet thick, were ideal for renting out as a private residence. Even so, the site gradually began to fall into disrepair, with both platforms demolished by 1967. A Greek gentleman who purchased Gotherington in 1970 added some interesting, if not incongruous, structural additions involving the former gentleman's conveniences. Consequently, when the present owner bought the station in 1981, the task of sympathetic, authentic restoration was always going to be a monumentous task. Rising to the challenge, he and an equally enthusiastic relative set about rebuilding a new 170-foot up platform. A fortuitous discovery of 30,000 Great Western Railway blue engineering bricks, dating back to 1906, buried on their land, provided the materials. However, it did take until August 1982 to complete the project. In 1985, the opportunity to purchase the derelict platforms from the former Withington station on the Midland and South Western Junction Railway proved ideal to build a new down platform. Over a period of months, they were dismantled brick by brick and stone by stone, to be rebuilt and completed by the winter of 1986. Gotherington may appear slightly different to the original structure, but many of the artefacts used to create this wonderful moment in time are completely authentic. This truly is a living history, growing and evolving all of the time, and it is the vision and enterprise of one man and his family, rather than an entire society, that have been responsible for this treasured addition to the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway. With views of Gotherington disappearing, the journey to Toddington begins in earnest as 3205 gathers pace through a deep cutting where the trackbed skirts the south side of Dixton Hill. There is then a long section of track which passes through the unusually named villages of Stanley-Pontlarge, Middle and Far Stanley. For railway enthusiasts the world over, Stanley-Pontlarge has a very special claim to fame, as the well-known transport author L.T.C. Rolt, often credited with being the father of railway preservation, lived there. The train next passes through the village of Gretton, where a halt stood from the time when the line opened until the withdrawal of services. It was more useful than many similar facilities, as it was at least close to the community it served. There were 2 iron pagodas, one on each platform, similar to the one just seen at Gotherington, providing much appreciated shelter for waiting passengers. They were demolished in the early 1960s, but the classic coffee and cream coloured structures, typical of rural Great Western Railway halts, are still fondly remembered by older residents. Moving on, the countryside opens out with sweeping views of the Vale of Evesham and the Malvern Hills. Today, the weather is not going to permit full justice being done to the landscape, with the watery winter sun failing to break through the afternoon mist. next feature we arrive at is one the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway is justly proud of. This is Greet Tunnel at the summit of the line, almost 300 feet above sea level. Constructed in blue engineering brick between the 7th of November 1904 and the 5th of December 1905, this is the longest ex-mainline tunnel on a preserved British railway. The middle section of the tunnel is in complete darkness, as both the north and south portals are hidden by the curve of the track. As 3205 exits back out into the daylight, a deep cutting leads us into Winchcombe Station. Today, Black Prince is operating as a private charter into Winchcombe, and consequently 3205 is not stopping here on this journey. However, it would be a shame to miss this beautifully presented station that GWR services usually stop at. Although this was the nearest suitable site for the town of Winchcombe, the station is actually in the village of Greet. It was first opened on the 1st of February 1905, and it's hard to believe looking at this fine establishment today that, after closure in the 1960s, the platforms and all the features were demolished and taken away. When the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway turned their attention to Winchcombe, there was only a weighbridge and the goods shed left standing. One of the most fascinating features of preserved railways is their ability to source authentic buildings, signal boxes and track, as well as the engines that actually run on the line. Here the station building is stood in the exact position of the original, and few visitors would ever guess that only a few short years ago there was nothing here but rubble. This is actually the old junction station from Monmouth Troy, and the sturdy Monmouth sandstone was dismantled by volunteers and transported to Winchcombe for rebuilding on the down platform. The signal box, which again occupies an authentic position, is virtually identical to the original, and it came from Birmingham Hall Green with the addition of a 37 lever frame from the Honeybourne West Loop box. Even the platform slabs were brought in from Birmingham Snow Hill and Cheltenham St James. The Friends of Winchcombe Station are responsible for the running of this much valued attraction on the GWR today. There is also plenty of space here for the storage of rolling stock, and the well-preserved goods shed now serves as the railway's carriage and wagon department workshop. On a lovely day, it's a very pleasant walk into the Cotswold market town of Winchcombe, which has the added bonus of a railway museum close to the church, housing a fascinating collection of railway artefacts and memorabilia from all over Great Britain. back on board and the landscape changes yet again. The undulating fields show the distinctive remnants of medieval strip farming with symmetrical raised mounds. Each of the strips was worked by a peasant to grow his own crops. Systematic ploughing created the raised mounds, which in turn produced a considerably greater surface area to farm. The long, narrow strips were the pathways between each plot. Today, it's the sheep that are benefiting most from the extra grass crop across these fields. Before reaching Toddington, 3205 passes through the point on the line where Hales Abbey Halt used to stand. The slopes of the hills are still covered with fruit trees, an industry that once dominated this area, with the Vale of Evesham continuing to be famous for fruit growing to this day. The Halt took its name from the 13th century Cistercian abbey close by, where the ruins are now tended by English Heritage. There's a site museum, and the charming parish church is well worth taking just a few minutes out of any busy schedule to step inside. Peaceful and uncluttered by ceremonial grandness, this little church boasts some fine medieval wall paintings, with a particularly well preserved image of St. Cecilia in the recess of the north chancel window. Although the train no longer stops at Hales Abbey, many visitors to the GWR at Toddington extend their journey to take in this significant historical landmark. Cutting back through the Cotswold escarpment past the now familiar engines and sights of Toddington, we arrive at Journey's End. This station was opened on the 1st of August 1904 and is typical of Great Western Railways at the turn of the 20th century. An attractive combination of blue and red bricks have been used to create buildings that blend into the landscape. There's a fine glazed metal canopy, and passengers through the years have been very grateful for the shelter it has provided. In 1980, when the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway started out at Toddington, there was a great deal of work to be done. Although the site had not been stripped quite as severely as Winchcombe, the original platforms had been completely demolished, and volunteers needed to rebuild them. Tracking down sufficient second-hand engineering bricks for authenticity also required a degree of resourcefulness, and the disused stations at Gloucester Eastgate and Ashton-under-Hill provided many, with an old railway bridge at Bourton-on-the-Water completing the recycling project. The paving slabs came from a Cheltenham footpath, with the large edging slabs brought in from a variety of stations. Lighting here is particularly atmospheric, with some of the lamp posts being ex-Great Western Railway from Ogmore Vale, South Wales. As dusk settles at Toddington, it's evident that there is something very special about the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway that goes way beyond bricks, mortar, track and machinery. With over 2,000 members that have skills enough between them to keep everything on course, although the operation is steeped in history, it's also alive, thriving and very much of today. This is indeed a fitting memorial to the founders of this preserved line, some of whom have now sadly passed away, but their hard work will never be forgotten as future generations enjoy the delights of the GWR. And what of the future? Earlier on in this programme we talked about the GWR's plans, and not only are they pretty ambitious, they are also extremely achievable. Back in 1981, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway actually purchased the track bed from Broadway to Cheltenham, and for the time being all efforts are being focused on running train services into Cheltenham Racecourse Station. Every year, Cheltenham races draw more and more visitors to this prestigious racecourse from all over the world. In Gold Cup week, the town of Cheltenham is completely caught up with an influx of racegoers, and traffic at peak times is often gridlocked, so restoring this station could well improve matters dramatically. Cheltenham Racecourse Station was built in the early years of the 20th century, catering for the many excursion trains on race days. It was opened in 1906 with two 700-foot-long platforms, which were linked by a footpath across the adjacent road bridge. Even this facility struggled to cope with the exceptionally long race day trains, and the down platform was later extended by a further 260 feet to accommodate them. A ticket office was constructed in March 1912 and is still a familiar landmark from the A435. The wooden frame was prefabricated at the Great Western Railway workshops at Swindon, and, unusually for a main station building, it wasn't built on the platform. There were two smaller buildings, one on each platform, which served as shelters and toilets, but they were demolished many years ago. The ticket office is a unique piece of railway heritage, with a remarkable steel roof that gives the appearance of slate cladding. This unusual roof was patented by a Wolverhampton company, and is thought to be the only one of its kind surviving in Britain. There were barriers at the entrance to the platforms, which helped railway staff to cope with the race day crowds, discouraging any who might try to board the trains without a ticket. With a general decline in railway traffic through the 1950s, the station was eventually closed on the 25th of March 1968. There were a number of occasions when BR did reprieve the station, opening for specific race days, including the 7th of April 1971, when Her Majesty the Queen used the service. Cheltenham Races has always had a royal following, with Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother being a particular favourite. Cheltenham Racecourse Station was last in use for the race meeting of the 16th to the 18th of March 1976. With the whole line closing shortly afterwards. There is no doubt that GWR trains will again run into Cheltenham, and in the not too distant future. As things stand at the present time, a works train actually pulled into Cheltenham Racecourse Station at lunchtime on the very last day of the year, and it won't be long before steam trains will follow. This kind of resilience and determination is precisely why the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway is so successful, and thoughts are already being turned to a further major project for when Cheltenham Racecourse Station is fully operational again. Already the GWR owns the trackbed north of Toddington to the lovely Cotswold town of Broadway, and plans to build a new station there will give visitors to the railway a major tourist attraction as an additional destination. Once the Broadway connection has been achieved, the short distance to Honeybourne will be the next target, where the opportunity to link up with the National Railway network still exists. North of Honeybourne, the trackbed to Stratford-Upon-Avon is owned by several different parties and, as a result, opening the line back up to the town synonymous with William Shakespeare will without doubt be a challenging enterprise. However, the day that sees Stratford-Upon-Avon Racecourse linked by the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway to Cheltenham Racecourse will be a very proud moment indeed, and if past form is anything to go by, it's not a case of asking, will it ever happen? It's just simply a question of when. Early this morning there was an air of expectation as drivers, firemen, the station master and other officials all collaborated to get the engines running to schedule. Just 24 hours earlier, the chances of getting Black Prince in steam seemed debatable, but the tenacious spirit that the members of the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway are famous for won the day. 3205 has also done a superb job, giving hours of pleasure to visitors of all ages, from the tiny tots waving Thomas the Tank Engine flags, through to nostalgic grandparents, sharing a little of their youth with the generation of tomorrow. The GWR has also had a training exercise to complete aboard 3205, as a trainee fireman has been going through his final tests. After a great deal of work, all has gone well today, and his examiner and colleagues are all delighted that he's passed with flying colours. One of the most popular specialist events that the GWR holds on a regular basis is a photographic charter, which is dedicated to photographers, professional and keen amateur alike, in search of dramatic images. There are also special engine driving days available for the many enthusiasts who've always wanted to drive a train, with both diesel and steam on offer, and there is a pleasingly high percentage of regulars who come back year after year to enjoy the thrill of the footplate. As dusk starts to close in, it's time to return to Toddington for one last, very special treat. The atmosphere has now become very nostalgic, as the lamps have been lit, transmitting a warm yellow glow over Toddington's platforms. For those that still remain, with cameras at the ready, waiting for Black Prince to return to the station, there are some fantastic photo opportunities. By the time the familiar whistle is heard, letting everyone know that Black Prince is on the way, it's almost completely dark. Whispers have also started about the identity of David Shepherd's guests, and, for most railway enthusiasts, the opportunity to get a photograph of him, guiding his own unique engine back into Toddington, is well worth the wait. The black of the engine silhouettes against the winter night sky, and the scene is the epitome of everything that is worth preserving in a steam railway. It's an image that will never be forgotten, and as the flickering orange light from Black Prince's well-stoked fire illuminates the faces of the fortunate few on the footplate, there's plenty of speculation about who might be who. But this is a private charter, and Black Prince has been a wonderful bonus for the visitors here at Toddington today, not to mention the viewers of this programme. Black Prince has done us proud, and as for the passengers, we'll just have to leave you guessing. After all, anything's possible where royalty's concerned.